So Henry Kissinger, dead at 100. We went over this a little bit at the start of the show, but he's responsible for 3 to 4 million deaths, ballpark, violent coups in Latin America, genocides in Asia, an instrumental figure in prolonging the Vietnam War. Outside the United States, Kissinger is considered to be one of the worst criminals, war criminals in the modern era. But Tim, what were your immediate thoughts upon seeing this news last night as somebody who has, extensively covered both U.S. empire and Asia for decades?
Well, what I remembered most clearly was being in Japan in 1972 and seeing the headlines in the Japanese newspapers of Kissinger saying, "Peace is at hand." And after years and years of, opposing the Vietnam War and being kind of in the middle of it, actually visiting Vietnam when I was a kid, this was like a tremendous thing to hear. This war might be over. And then, everyone thought that, believed him. Peace is at hand. And then like a few weeks later, over the Christmas holidays in 1972, to show the Vietnamese that he meant business and to try to drive them back to the negotiating table, Nixon ordered the bombing of Hanoi by B-52s, days and days of relentless bombing. And this just showed the utter hypocrisy and evil nature of this man who was advising Nixon all during this period. And it was just sickening to see, how he pretended to be bringing peace and then inflicting this violence on Vietnam and all of Indochina. And I just, Vietnam, had a huge impact on me. I mean, I grew up in Tokyo and Seoul during the Vietnam War. I visited there when I was a kid, 12 years old. My father was a church relief worker and it did relief all over in Japan and Korea after the wars. And he had actually gone to Vietnam, to look at the situation in the early 1960s. And so, I knew a lot about Vietnam and the truth of U.S. intervention there. And Kissinger's lies just brought it home how disgraceful, this war was. And those were my first thoughts, not to mention all the other evil he's inflicted on the world.
Well, let's stay on the Vietnam War then for just a little bit, because we mentioned this at the start of the show, how basically Nixon and Kissinger were immensely deceitful in their what they would say publicly about the Vietnam War and what their designs were behind the scenes after Nixon got elected, and they expanded the war quite quickly after taking office. And then during that time, I guess, when did Kissinger become Secretary of State? But he's the only
69.
69.
Secretary of State was later.
Right.
National Security Advisor first.
National Security Advisor at that time, and then he's the only person to have ever held that position simultaneously. So just to give people a sense of how powerful he was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor for quite a while. What was that like at that time when, LBJ was opening up some measure of diplomacy at the sunset of his presidency, and then Nixon and Kissinger come into office and expand, and then also launch the secret carpet bombing of Cambodia?
Well, 1968, people might remember, Johnson was relentlessly bombing Vietnam, and the anti-war movement was really building up at home, and people were really disgusted with the war and the violence being inflicted on Vietnam. And I remember marching in 1968 in Tokyo, Americans against the war, and we were against, opposing the bombing of North Vietnam at the time, and also all the bombing and strafing that was going on in South Vietnam. And then during the election of 68, Nixon was promising a secret plan to end the war. And as we all learned later, Kissinger was telling anti-war folks that, Nixon was really serious, and he himself, Kissinger, was really serious and agreed with the critics of the Vietnam War. And then it turned out that, when these negotiations were going on, with the Johnson administration in Paris to end the war. Kissinger was there feeding information from the South Vietnamese side to Nixon, and they basically persuaded the South Vietnamese government and its military government not to go along with any agreement until Nixon came in. And this is like this really cynical action, and actually kind of treasonous, to be sending top secret information, back to a presidential candidate to undercut these negotiations. And then, Nixon announces, Vietnamization, or let the Vietnamese do the fighting, and the U.S. is going to slowly withdraw. But they just use this immense power of bombing and massive firebombing, and of course they, and bombed Cambodia secretly for years. Invaded Cambodia supposedly to drive clear out the Vietnamese sanctuary, so-called, but it was such utter hypocrisy. And all this time, of course, he's working with Nixon to reopen relations with China, which was a good thing overall, but basically they opened relations with China, and they wanted what Kissinger later called a decent interval, to basically let the South Vietnamese government collapse, which everyone knew it would. And that finally happened in 1975. But, it was all done through lies and deceit. And I was glad to see Lee Duc Tho, who was the Vietnamese negotiator when they did reach these 1973 peace agreements. Kissinger and Lee Duc Tho were given the Nobel Peace Prize, and Lee Duc Tho refused to accept the award because he knew what a complete hypocrite and deceitful person and violent person Kissinger was. And to his credit, he refused the Nobel Peace Prize. This was a peace after just mass murder in Indochina. And I kept up, that's how I got into journalism, was during the Vietnam War, and kind of looking at the economic factors that the business role that business played in making the weapons, and the military industrial complex, and how it wanted more war. And that's how I started into journalism. But I kept pretty careful track of what was going on in the 70s. And I think that one of the worst things he did was to give a green light when he was working for President Ford in 1975, was going to Indonesia, meeting with the General Suharto, who had taken over in a very, very bloody coup in 1965, where over 500,000 people, communists and Chinese, were slaughtered in Indonesia, and gave them a green light to invade the newly independent nation of East Timor, which was alongside one of the islands in that archipelago there. And East Timor had just been decolonized. Portugal there had been a kind of revolution in Portugal, and they had let go of their colonies. And so East Timor became an independent nation. And there was oil near there. And, Suharto, the government that was taking over in East Timor was a progressive government that wanted to, do better its people, better the conditions of its own people. And they gave a green light for Suharto to invade this little tiny defenseless island that had hardly any kind of military at all. And for years, they did. And it was a genocide. Hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered in East Timor. And it was a virtually unknown kind of struggle. But it just represented the kind of, he just didn't give a rat's ass about people, any other countries. It's just the power of the United States, and just use war and bombing to get your way. And of course, we all know what happened in 1973 in Chile, where he was behind, the overthrow of Allende and undercutting that democratically elected government. Just a disgraceful record. And what's really I mean, it's just sickening to see all these political figures laud him for his statesmanlike actions and what he contributed to American foreign policy. You know,
Yeah.
he contributed blood.
Tim, I'm curious to hear you reflect, like, the pride of place that he's maintained in American politics. Like, has it surprised you, or is it just kind of symptomatic?
Well, it's symptomatic of the way the system works. I mean, we reward people who do things like this. I mean, Hillary Clinton, I saw Chris Christie, praising him the other day. Democrats, Republicans that are in power and out of power want to get into power. They love this guy because what he represented was the ultimate use of American power to crush any kind of opposition to U.S. power anywhere in the world, and to use the most cynical means, the most violent means. But that's considered, statesmanlike, and it's just appalling, to hear these liberals, especially, praise this guy, Samantha, what's her name, who's head of USAID.
Power.
Samantha Power. These pictures she has of him, hanging out with Kissinger. I mean, here's someone who spoke out against genocide, right? Tried to make this an American policy issue to stop genocide. And here she is hanging out with one of them, a man who
key architect of genocide.
Architect of genocide,
yes.
exactly.
Yes.